introduce the speakers and everything. Just maybe to give some words about citizens' assemblies, which I think is right now an interesting situation, of course, also because of Corona. Like a lot of movements right now are discussing what scholars like Naomi Klein say, like, no, it's not enough. We need to have a position on what do we actually want beyond what's the problem out there, the climate crisis, democratic crisis, rampant inequality. And Extinction Rebellion has a very special take on this. They entered the stage and said, we want democratic renewal. This is our solution that we offer. And more concretely, they say, we need a citizens' assembly on a national level. But there are, of course, a lot of details that need to be figured out, and that are also special for different countries. And so it's really cool that we today have like 3 very interesting practical perspectives on citizens' assemblies, and also an introductory presentation on citizens' assemblies to give some ideas about this. So we will hear 4 presentations, first from Darragh, an introductory one, then from Clare, then from Dimitri, and then from Camille, and then we will have time for questions. Throughout, you can already write questions in the chat. So you can just write your name and your question that you have in the chat, and we will keep them and then get back to them at the end of the presentation. Before we start, it would be nice to just get a little idea of who's actually in the room. Like, we don't have, of course, time for a whole check-in. We are a little bit too many for that, which is really cool. But maybe just write in the chat where you're from. Like, you can be as specific as you want, but if you're from a small village in the Netherlands, maybe add some indication where that is. Yeah, just go for it. Let's see who's here. I will just read out a couple. Yay, let's see. Amsterdam, Hungary, Budapest, Leipzig, Amsterdam, Deventer in the Netherlands, Olst, is that Paul? Rotterdam, Enschede, Enschede in Germany, that's interesting. Utrecht, nice, cool. Hey everyone, hey Malek, hey to all the XR people I haven't seen in ages, good to see you again. Okay, nice, good that you're all here. Darragh will start with a little introductory presentation yeah, on citizens' assemblies. Go for it, Darragh.
Okay, thank you very much, Len, and thank you very.
Sorry, one thing I forgot.
Ahead.
Thanks, Armando, for reminding me for this. Armando, by the way, is the tech guy in the background who's helping us with this. We are going live, so this is going to be recorded. If you, Armando, maybe you have to say something about this. Like, if people don't want to be recorded, was this announced?
Yeah, it's pretty simple, actually. Hi, I'm Armando. If we're going live on Facebook right now, and both so we can only see the people that are speaking, and if you just don't want to be seen on Facebook, then it may be a good idea if you turn off your camera so that you retain your privacy and there's not going to be any issues there. And then I think we should have a pretty smooth webinar here. So wishing Leonard and the rest lots of luck. The question from Magdalena before you start, Darragh. Is it okay if Magdalena and Shaki observe and write about it? No problems, right?
I certainly don't have a problem with that. If any of the speakers have an issue with that, everyone's putting their thumbs up. I see, lovely. So yeah, great, and yeah, great. I think the idea is to spread the word and do that. So thank you very much for writing about that. I'll just introduce myself. My name is Darragh Conway. I am active with XR here in the Netherlands, where I coordinate the National Outreach and Training Circle. I also work in climate change. I work for a company called Climate Focus, also based here in Amsterdam. And I've been working in climate change, governance and legal issues for the past 10 years. And citizen assemblies is more of a recent interest for me. And what I want to do today is give kind of an overview presentation. Why citizen assemblies? Why should we consider citizens assemblies as part of the solution to the climate crisis? And what makes citizen assemblies different? What are they? And what makes them different to the approach that we currently mostly use, which is parliamentary democracy? So I'm going to just start sharing my screen with you. One moment. Now, so can you please just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Excellent. All right. So basically, I'm going to begin by, let's see, actually, see if I can get rid of this. Okay, now you can see that better. I'm going to begin by just democracy. And representative democracy is based on this idea that we elect politicians, right? And what they do, well, they represent us. So they are supposed to act in our interests. We elect the politicians that we think will act in our best interests and according to our will. And they make laws and they make policies that keep us safe and ensure prosperity and well-being, and that includes economic prosperity, but also just our health and our happiness and all the things we need to have a kind of prosperous and happy life, right? That's kind of the idea. We don't make the laws ourselves, but we elect politicians to do it on our behalf, right? Why do we do this? First of all, because direct democracy is where people vote on everything, right? And you see this sometimes with referenda. And so in some countries, in my country, Ireland, we have quite a lot of referenda, but you know, it's only on really big issues, once every few years, big constitutional issues. Some countries like Switzerland, they have more referenda. They have them quite regularly. But to have referenda on every single topic would not really be feasible. Especially, you know, you've got very big countries, it's impossible for everybody to vote on everything. And so we elect politicians to vote on our behalf. We also assume that because not every ordinary citizen can be expected to know about all these complex topics that laws need to be made on, that policies need to be made on. So we elect politicians who we assume will become experts in the topic or will have access to better information and skills and judgment to make these decisions, right? And if we don't like what they do, we kick them out after a few years. That's representative democracy. And this is by far the main form of democracy in the world. In fact, it's the main political system that exists in the world today. All these countries you see in blue on this map have some form of representative democracy. There's a couple that have different systems. We have one-party communist systems, we have monarchies, but most countries have a representative democracy. And some countries arguably have, let's say, are more democratic than others. In some, the democracy might be a bit of an illusion, you could say, but at least on paper, all those countries in blue have some form of representative democracy. So really the main system in the world. Now, has this system addressed the major crisis of the day? That's what I want to talk about in this next part. And firstly, I want to go back a little bit in time and look back to before I was born and before probably most people on the call were born, way back in the 60s, when messages of climate change were starting to become more frequent. Throughout the 60s and the 70s, more and more scientists were telling us that this climate change is happening, that humans are making the climate change, and that this could be very dangerous. And from the 80s in particular, we started to see a lot more frequent warnings from scientists, and they were getting more dire and dire. So you see here a couple of news experts from the 1980s, 1988, from early 2000s. And you see the warnings get worse and worse. They're more dire as time goes on. And most recently, a couple of years ago, the IPCC, which is the main scientific body internationally that studies climate change, they said we've got 12 years to completely turn this ship around, to reduce our emissions drastically, or else we will have very little chance of stopping the climate catastrophe. And that might even be too optimistic. But 12 years, that was 2 years ago, so about 10 years left, if we want to believe the IPCC. Now, you might say, well, okay, but nobody, you know, scientists have been saying this, but people didn't really care, and that's why politicians didn't take action. People actually have been consistently demanding action. You know, way back to the first Earth Day in 1970, And well, there's more here. Of course, you don't get too many photographs from before 2000 online, but you can see that every couple of years you have these major protests, and in between, of course, there are many smaller protests. There are people writing letters. There are people through their votes. People have been calling for action on this for years. In fact, last year we had 6 million people, the biggest climate protest ever, joined protests around the world on 2 particular weekends, part of the global climate strike. So there's been huge pressure on politicians to do something, but unfortunately, they haven't done much. Okay. There's also an overwhelming, especially now, finally, after many years, there really is an overwhelming sense in people that we need very strong action. So this is a survey that was done in various different countries and asked people, do you believe not just that climate change is happening, but that we're actually in a climate emergency that will become extremely dangerous without big cuts in emissions? And you see across all of the country surveys, very large numbers of people agreed, right? You have over 50% of people in half of the countries, over 50% of people are strongly agreeing. But in almost all the countries, you've got around 75% or most countries more than 75% saying that they agree that we're in a climate emergency, not just climate change happening, we're actually in an emergency here. Okay, so there's strong support for bold action, and yet this bold action has remained elusive over the years. And it's been disappointment after disappointment for those of us who are old enough to remember way back to when Bush pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. That was probably the first major global disappointment for those following climate action. But there were many to come. We had Copenhagen in 2009, where everybody thought that would be where we'd make the big deal. And it wasn't, unfortunately. There was very little that came out of it. Then Canada withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. Emissions continued to rise. Last year in Madrid, we had a big climate conference that also failed to produce anything really of significance. Even on some of the more, the basic technical details, they couldn't work it out. So it's been disappointment after disappointment for people demanding stronger climate action. And the politicians have failed time and time again to deliver on it. Now, all of this comes against the backdrop of emissions continuing to rise at really a rapid rate. Global warming is happening faster than we think. So I mentioned earlier the IPCC. This is this global body that studies climate change. Unfortunately, even though it has the world's top scientists in there, it often does tend to get things wrong. In fact, it's often more conservative than the actual science. And so, an article in the journal Nature a couple of years ago, they said 1.5 degree of warming, which is already considered to be dangerous levels of global warming, could happen a decade earlier. We could have that level of global warming within the next decade, by just after 2030. So based on current ambitions, based on the pledges that countries have made under the Paris Agreement so far, by the end of the century, we're looking at only having a 1% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is the goal of the Paris Agreement. We have a 5% chance of staying below 2 degrees, and most likely we'll be somewhere between 2 and 4.9 degrees, probably around the region of 3.2 degrees. And what does that mean? 3.2 degrees has been described by scientists as catastrophic levels of global warming. 1.5 degrees is dangerous. 3.2 degrees is catastrophic, potentially including runaway climate change, which I don't really have time to get into now if you don't know what runaway climate change is, but it's pretty terrifying. Now, if you look at the democracies of the world, well, very few countries actually do have a climate-compatible target, a Paris-compatible target. 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees are both targets in the Paris Agreement. There's a kind of a range of targets. And only Morocco, actually, a kingdom, as it happens, has a 1.5 degree compatible target. There are a couple of other countries that have 2 degree compatible targets. And this is not to say that necessarily monarchies are better, or, I'm not advocating that, but it is interesting to see that none of the representative democracies, these systems in which people who are concerned about climate change, very concerned, elect politicians to keep them safe, none of them have adopted a target that is in line with the Paris Agreement. I'm talking a lot about climate change here. It would be remiss not to mention that we're also facing a major biodiversity crisis, an ecological crisis of epic proportions, which is every bit as frightening as the climate crisis. So the rate of species is going down at an unprecedented rate. Extinction rates are accelerating. We are at the moment in the sixth mass extinction. So there's a lot that's gone wrong, and there's a lot that our elected politicians have failed to address. Now, where did this all go wrong? I think there's a couple of problems with representative democracy. There's lots of good things about it too, but there are a couple of particular problems with a purely representative form of democracy that I think have contributed to all these issues that we're seeing. And the first is systemic myopia. So myopia, short-sightedness. So people like myself who wear glasses, it's difficult for us to see far ahead. In the same way, it's very difficult often for politicians to see far into the future. They can see far into the future, but they often choose not to, because election cycle is every 5 years. And think, well, I'm just going to address the things that are going to get elected again in 5 years' time. You know, no need to think too much in the future. And this is something we consistently see. Many studies have shown that systemic myopia is one of the main reasons politicians have failed to address climate change, putting short-term economic interest first. A second reason is that a lot of politicians have bought into disinformation. Now, we know that ordinary people buy into disinformation too, but as we said at the beginning, one of the reasons that we elect politicians is because we assume that their entire job is to make these laws and to make these policies, so they should have the best information possible, and they should know how to distinguish good information from bad information. Unfortunately, a lot of the politicians have bought into the disinformation. And if we look across the water in the United States, major companies, usually oil companies or people with major investments in oil, coal, and gas companies, have invested a lot of money in funding climate denial. And that has paid a lot of dividends. 63% of Americans are represented by a climate denier in Congress. And that's not limited to the United States. Here in the Netherlands, a couple of months ago, this great article came out in the Volkskrant about how a certain gentleman named Fritz Butcher, with support from dozens of major Dutch companies, laid the basis for climate skepticism in the Netherlands. And they delayed climate action by years in the Netherlands by sowing the seeds of doubt among politicians here. This was back in the 2000s in particular. A third reason is that corporate lobbying is very strong in regards to climate action. So this is an image from Influence Map, great organization, does great work looking at the influence that different corporations and different powerful interests have on climate change and other things. And these are just samples. This is by no means comprehensive, but you can see how all over the world, on every major continent, corporations have managed to weaken different types of climate laws through lobbying, through having a huge amount of money to invest in lobbying politicians to weaken climate laws. So representative democracy, for all of its benefits, has failed to a large degree to address what is almost undoubtedly the greatest challenge of our time, the twin challenges of the climate and ecological crises. So that leaves us with a question. Is there a third way? And this is what we're really talking about here today. And it's not about replacing representative democracy, but it's about supplementing it. It's about a system that can balance out some of the problems that representative democracy has been having by encouraging more participation of citizens, so in decision making. So what are citizen assemblies? I'm going to play a very short video because I think it explains this quite nicely, and it'll give you a break from my voice for a moment.
Darragh, I think there's no sound.
Oh, my apologies. Okay, that is a technical issue we probably should have run through. Okay, apologies about that. I'll just basically explain what the video said. Essentially, that there's a spectrum upon which democracy can work. On one hand, you have representative democracy, which I talked about, where we elect our politicians and they take decisions on our behalf. On the other end of the spectrum, you have direct democracy, like referenda, where citizens directly vote on issues. In the middle, you have this kind of participative democracy or deliberative democracy, and citizen assemblies sit here. So essentially, the idea of citizens assemblies is a certain number of citizens are selected essentially at random. I'll speak a bit more about that later. And they are given all the information they need, and they come up with recommendations on a particular topic. And I'm going to go in a bit more detail on how citizen assemblies works in the next slide. But firstly, where have they worked? Well, firstly, we've had citizen assemblies already in the Netherlands at national level, and they're currently being set up at local level. And we'll hear more about that in one of the later presentations. So in my own country, Ireland, there's been a citizen assembly at national level, and my colleague Clare is going to talk about that later. There's also been a citizen assembly on climate in the UK, which is just wrapped up, actually. We have the ongoing citizen assembly in France on climate, and my colleague Dimitri will speak about that in a little while. We've had one in Iceland some years back on constitutional reform in the wake of financial crisis. And there's some early stage initiatives at local level in Italy on climate change. There's also in Canada, British Columbia at state level, at province level, I should say, they've had electoral reform. There's a few more, but these are some of the main examples. Now, what makes citizen assemblies different to representative democracy? The first one is that they are really representative. Now, I know you say representative democracy, well, that should be representative too. Unfortunately, it's often not. Here's a picture of an average Dutch street, which you can see is very ethnically diverse. This is the Dutch cabinet at the moment. It's very, very white. And you see this all over the world in countries that are very, very diverse. Often the ruling class, the politicians that are elected, tend to be from the dominant, let's say, sector of society, which in most of Europe and in the United States, it's usually wealthy white people. Same goes for the House of Representatives here in the Netherlands, where females and immigrants and Afro-Dutch are completely underrepresented. On the other hand, the Citizens' Assembly should be completely representative of society. Different citizen assemblies take different approaches to this, but at the very least, they should be representative in terms of age and gender and ethnic backgrounds. In many cases, also in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds, in terms of potentially even their views on climate change, which they've just done in the UK. That's potentially controversial, but we could discuss that a bit later in the discussion session. Secondly, citizen assemblies are evidence-based. What does that mean? Is that they are not making the decisions based on opinions, which we often see, unfortunately, even in political decision-making, a lot of it is not based on the soundest evidence, as we saw for a lot of climate deniers in decision-making positions. Citizen assemblies, you have top experts that are brought in to present their expert opinion and all the relevant facts to the members of the Citizen Assembly, and the decisions are made on that basis. There's a fair and balanced representation of different stakeholders from different viewpoints, but they don't just let anybody in. So there are minimum criteria for evidence, so it has to be robust, accepted evidence that's been peer-reviewed, which is also very different than in direct democracy and referenda. You'll also see a lot of misinformation around that. You don't get that too much in citizen assemblies because you've got a very good quality control process. Also, usually they'll provide accessible briefing materials for the members so they can really understand, so it's not too much technical information. Third characteristic is that they are deliberative. What that means is that the decisions are based on a real deliberation, on a real discussion. So it's not people on one side shouting at people on the other side, go, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, no, you don't consider the evidence. It's really a discussion, and it's facilitated by a professional facilitator, and it's based on the evidence. Now, does this always go perfectly? I don't know. Maybe some of our people with experiences in citizen assemblies will tell us a bit about that later. But that is the principle. And I think there's a lot to be said for that when you compare it or contrast it to a parliamentary sitting where it can be very, very adversarial. Facilitators, of course, they encourage active listening, they encourage critical assessment of other people's views, so it's really a thorough evidence-based deliberation. A fourth characteristic, citizen assemblies are, or at least should be, independent, fair, and transparent. So they're run by impartial coordinators, so it's not run by a political party, it's run by somebody with no personal or political interest in the outcome. Various different stakeholders are heard, so you might hear from the oil lobby or the agricultural lobby, but they're not able to engage in individual lobbying. So they're heard, they have their time, they say their piece in front of everybody, and that's it. So you consider everybody, but there's no kind of backroom lobbying that you often get in normal politics. Everybody has an equal vote, of course. You will normally get, some people wanting to speak more than others, and the facilitators, a good facilitator will do their best to make sure that everybody being heard, even those that are naturally a little bit quieter. And usually everything will be public available online, and that's been the case, I think, in most citizen assemblies to date. Finally, and this is the one that doesn't always happen, but in principle, citizen assemblies should be impactful. And this is certainly what Extinction Rebellion asks for. Our third demand is to adopt a citizen assembly on the climate and ecological crisis. And a key part of that demand is that it's impactful. And our speakers later will tell you how impactful they think their citizen assemblies have been. But in principle, there should be clear rules on how the government should respond to the citizen assembly recommendation. So it shouldn't just be that the government says, okay, we'll make some recommendations and then we'll think about it. There should be clear rules in advance that, let's say, for example, if over 80% of votes are in favor, then we'll definitely adopt it. Or if it's over 60%, then it'll be sent to a parliamentary committee. There's many ways you could do this, and I believe in France they have done that. So these are, by the way, again, these are proposals that we have. These are not adopted by every citizen assembly, but I think to be, to be worthwhile, there should be a defined impact that citizen assemblies will have. Now, interestingly, citizens often do adopt very radical recommendations, and I know I'm short on time, so I won't go into too much detail here. I think Clare and Dimitri will tell you about what were the recommendations that were recommended in Ireland and in France. Maybe just to mention in Iceland, one of the interesting proposals, a couple of interesting proposals there, is that they would nationalize natural resources. So that was the proposing citizen assembly there, and that citizens would have the right to propose referenda. So they really proposed a radical reform of the democratic process. So just to conclude on this, the current system we have has failed, absolutely, to address the climate and ecological crisis, despite calls from citizens and warnings from scientists for decades now. We are in the midst of an unprecedented crisis, and we need to think of new ways. We can't just keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. The citizen assemblies offer something new. They have been tried and tested by now in a number of different countries, and they really have the potential to propose strong and fair policies that respond to the science, but that also respond to the needs of ordinary people. Right? You've got ordinary people in there making the decisions, so there's very little danger of decisions being made that are out of touch. They can ensure policy making is based on sound evidence and reasoned deliberation, avoiding this very divided atmosphere that we have in society at the moment. They can provide ordinary citizens with a real role in solving this crisis, which usually they don't have at all. And it can help to renew the trust in the democratic systems that I think in many countries has been lost or at least eroded in the last years. So with that, I'll conclude and hand back over to Leonard.
All right, thanks, Darragh. This was a fantastic introductory presentation. Really good, thanks. Let's not wait long. Let's just jump right away to Clare, who was in the Citizens Assembly in Ireland and can now give some more practical insights, I guess, from how it's actually to be on such a Citizens Assembly and all the things around it. Clare, you go.
Perfect, thanks, Leonard. Just checking you can hear me okay? Yeah, yep. Great. So 1 second now. Hi, so my name is Clare. I was a citizen member of the Irish Citizens Assembly from 2016 until 2018. I currently work as Sustainability Officer for Native Events. We provide sustainability consultancy for the cultural sector and events and festivals. And I'm also studying a master's in climate change in Dublin City University. So, I can't change that. Oh, there we go. So that is me. That was the final Citizens Assembly in 2018. And I had been randomly selected. I was at home in my parents' house back in Monaghan, and someone came to the door and she asked if I'd be interested in being a member of the Citizens Assembly. And I actually, I was pretty politically engaged anyway, so I actually knew what I was being asked. I was familiar with what the Citizens Assembly was. So I was kind of in awe that I had been asked, because I knew it was coming, and I knew 99 citizens were going to be selected at random. So I very enthusiastically said yes to becoming a member. And that was the start of the journey. I actually, at the time, I wasn't particularly interested in climate change, but I suppose it was on my periphery, but I hadn't really engaged with it, I guess, at any level. Yeah, so the Assembly, 99 citizens were selected at random. There were initially 10 weekends allocated to the Assembly, but in the end, it was actually extended to 12 weekends. So I suppose it was quite a big ask, I think, when citizens were being selected. It was that they would be available for 10 weekends over the course of a year, and would give up their whole weekend to come to Dublin to be involved in the Assembly. And it ended up taking over 15 months altogether, which was a long time. And there was actually quite a lot of dropouts in between the first Assembly and the last one. I think only about 50% of the initial citizens stayed on for the full Assembly. And 5 issues were to be deliberated. So the first one was the 8th Amendment of the Constitution. So that was an article in the Irish Constitution that banned abortion in any case at all. So 5 weekends were allocated to this one. The second one was how the state can make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change. And this was actually initially only allocated 1 weekend for us to learn all about climate change, to deliberate on it, and then to vote. And a citizen member actually stood up and said that that's nowhere near enough really for climate change. So they decided to extend it to 2 weekends, which was still a very small amount of time to try and understand climate change, the science, the policy, and then potential solutions. And then the other 3 were the challenges and opportunities of an aging population, fixed term parliaments, and the manner in which referendums are held. So it would work. So yeah, in or around 99 people would meet in Dublin for a weekend. Experts would speak to us, experts in their fields. Really, for climate change, we had experts on energy, agriculture, and transport, because they're the biggest sources of Ireland's CO2 emissions. After we heard each group of experts, we would break off into smaller groups, and we would deliberate on what we just heard, and there would be a facilitator there who would kind of, I suppose, guide the discussion, and like Darragh said, to make sure that people were heard and everyone had their say. And then we had the opportunity to ask questions to all of the experts. And at the end of each topic, we would then vote on a ballot on what recommendations we wanted to make to the government. So the 8th Amendment was the first one. That was 5 weekends of deliberation. And it was, I suppose this was a topic that historically for Ireland was huge, because we've always, it's always been illegal to get an abortion in Ireland, and it was even illegal to refer people over to the UK for abortions for a long time as well. So, and this was actually the main reason that I got involved in the Assembly at all, because I've been following this issue quite closely. And And yeah, it was a really, really, really incredible experience. I mean, 99 people came in. They all had totally different life stories and views, and everyone came in with an open mind, which was the thing that struck me the most, and really listened to the experts. And then in the end, 87% of members voted that Article 40.3.3 should not be retained in the Irish Constitution. And that then led to a referendum in the general public in Ireland, and that passed with 66.4% of the vote, which was amazing and very unexpected, I think, for a lot of people, given Ireland used to be such a conservative country. So climate change then, which I'm sure is the one you guys are most interested in. Ireland has been known to be a laggard. Like, I don't know if you can see there that we were like one of the worst in Europe for a very, very, very long time, and I think still are, to be honest. But we were always getting fined for never reaching our targets, and the cause of that was really because of our agriculture emissions, and also because we're quite dependent on cars here. So the government asked us to consider the topic of how the state can make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change, which was interesting because we were such a laggard that they were asking us to go from a laggard to one of the leaders internationally, which I thought was quite funny. And I think a lot of the other citizens thought was quite funny too. So there were in and around 99 citizens. Some people would not show up. So I think there was about like 80 something each weekend. We had 2 weekends on climate change. There were 1,185 public submissions, which was a lot, because we really only had the time. You're kind of expected to do a lot of reading in between each weekend, and it wasn't really possible to read over 1,000 submissions. So that was a tricky point. And then we got 21 expert presentations, as I said, in the area of agriculture, energy and transport, and then some community leaders in renewable energy as well. And then we made 13 recommendations. And it was quite funny. We made these recommendations, but the general narrative in the media was that they were very radical. But I don't think anyone really, we didn't feel they were radical at the time based on everything that we had just heard. So it was kind of strange to have that response and everyone think that was really radical, because to us it was just the obvious recommendations. So yeah, these are some of the recommendations that were considered very radical. One of them was, to ensure climate is at the centre of all decision making in Ireland, and to create a new independent government body with legislative powers. So this actually, we recommended this, but this actually turned out to legally not be an okay thing to do. So this recommendation, even though 97% of us agreed with it, it didn't really, didn't fly. And then, but all of the 13 recommendations, every single one of them had over 80% of the members vote, which I think is really interesting, because I think it shows that there wasn't really any disagreement, that once we were presented with the facts, that there was a very like unanimous kind of consensus on what needed to be done. So then our 13 recommendations were taken, and a joint Oireachtas committee on climate change was set up, and that was a cross-party committee, and the Oireachtas is the Irish government. That was a cross-party committee on our recommendations. They took them and then they published their own report, as you can see there. And then the government took their report and posted their very own climate action plan. A lot of people felt that they sort of weakened down the committee's proposals, which I sort of feel like as well. They weren't legally obliged to take on any of the recommendations that we made, or the recommendations that the committee made, which I think was a shame. What else? So yeah, as I said, it's not legally binding. So if you look at the 5 topics that we did, they've responded to the 8th Amendment, climate change and challenges of an ageing population. But as of yet, and nearly 2 years has passed since our last assembly, they've completely ignored our recommendations on fixed term parliaments And they've also ignored our recommendations on the manner in which referendums are held. So I think that's a real shame that so much work and money was put into this assembly, and then they just sort of pick and chose the bits that they wanted to take on. So yeah, pros and cons. It's a lot of what Darragh said already. Informed, evidence-based and reasoned debate, which was incredible, to be presented with the science, to discuss it, like how it would affect our lives, and then to make those recommendations based on the science. Takes out the election cycle, everyone there, no one was there with any kind of ulterior motive. And I found it really inspiring that everyone there really wanted what was best for the country. That's what I found anyway, and went in with a really open mind. The cons, as I've said, non-legally binding, unfortunately. Only 2 weekends given to climate change. We all felt very overwhelmed being given this topic and trying to understand it and trying to make recommendations on it. I remember the kind of general feeling was that, why aren't the government just listening to the experts? Why do we have to be this in-between thing? So there was a bit of frustration around that. Slow and delayed action. It was February 2016 when the government initially came up with the idea of a Citizens' Assembly on climate change, and it was June 2019 by the time they published their climate action plan. So it's a slow process, is what I would say, and based on the urgency of the climate crisis, it's I would sort of agree with people that it sort of delays action. And then a broad question as well. Our question on making the state a leader on climate change was way too broad, and I think for it to be effective, it should be a lot more specific. And yeah, that's all I have to say. And I suppose for me personally, it was an amazing thing to be involved in. I didn't know anything about climate change before, and it really opened my eyes, and I kind of I did a career pivot afterwards, where I'm now studying climate change and working in that area as well. So I'm really grateful to have had that experience, and would love to be able to share everything I learned with everyone else. So yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Now you managed. Thank you as well. Super interesting. I heard this a lot from people who joined Citizens' Assemblies, that they had this transformational experience with it. Really cool to hear that. One more time for everyone, remember to write up your questions. If you have them now, you will probably forget them because there are 2 more interesting questions coming up, but we will get back to them at the end of the next 2 presentations. Dimitri, you go on the French Citizens' Assembly. We don't know each other too well, so maybe just introduce yourself. I think that's will do it more justice. Cool.
Right. You can hear me, right? Okay. Hello everybody, and thanks for the invitation. I'm a researcher in political science at the University of Paris 8 and of University of Lausanne, and I work on deliberative mini-publics and sortition and democracy for about 8 years now. So I'm a qualitative sociologist, which means I'm conducting fieldwork inquiry based mainly on observation and qualitative interviews. And the country I mainly worked in are Ireland, France, and Switzerland. So I was not a member of the Irish Citizens' Assembly, but I didn't miss a single meeting. I was in the back watching and taking notes every time. And I'm doing the same process for other deliberative mini-publics in France and Switzerland. The latest one being the Citizen Convention for Climate, which is not done yet. They still have 1 weekend to go. That was supposed to happen if there was not a pandemic. Is it working? Okay. Going back. Okay. So I won't talk about the other cases I'm studying. I'm going to focus on this one. So in order to understand how it came about that in France we had such a process, with an important mandate. So the mandate of the convention is how to reduce greenhouse gas emission in France by at least 40% in relation to the 90s level by 2030 in a spirit of social justice. And so that came not out of the nice and goodwill of the governments, if you want to say so. It directly originates from the fact that there was a massive movement of protest. And this massive movement of protest is called les Gilets jaunes, or Yellow Jacket, which was triggered partially because precisely the government wanted to increase the tax on gas, but for cars and not for planes, not for ships and from cruise boats that are actually polluting more than cars. And this movement, which was not connected to a specific party, was violently repressed by police brutality over the course of a year. It was quite a long movement. At the same time, there was secret negotiation between the government and various actors. I don't have the time to go through it, but mainly people that work in civic tech, so are selling this type of engagement projects to local authorities or national authorities. And the government decided to launch at the end of 2018 the National Great Debate, which was a process mixing deliberative and participatory democracy. So there were over 3 months of deliberation. They spent 12 million euros on it. And for 1.5 days on weekends, they had 18 citizen conferences, so randomly selected citizen conferences. And they had a lot of contribution on climate and ecology, because there was 5 topics and one of them was climate and ecology, but there was no impact. There was no uptake of this process, even though it was a costly one. However, at the end of the process, President Macron announced that he was launching a convention, a citizen convention on climate. Okay, is it working? Okay. So now let's look at that. So here you have one pictures of it. So yeah, so you have 150 citizens that are selected. I wouldn't say randomly. I would say they are selected through stratified random selection, because there are criteria. And the 6 criteria in this case were sex, age, level of diploma or degree, social professional category, type of territory, whether you live in a city center or in a rural area, and geographical area, which means like regions of France. France has many regions, so they wanted to have this type of diversity. As you can see, of course, there is no such thing as race in France, because that's illegal. We don't. The French constitution and laws don't recognize the concept of race as being a valid one. And there was as well no opinion check. Usually in deliberative mini-publics, especially in the device that is called deliberative polls, you check what is the opinion of the citizen before you include them in the panel, because you also want that the people saying yes to participate in the deliberation are representative of the spread of opinion. So to give you an example, there was a citizen assembly after Brexit to decide which type of Brexit was wanted. It was happening quickly after Brexit, so before the whole mess of negotiation. And of course, one of the criteria was we want an even distribution, a distribution that reflects the outcome of the referendum between leavers, remainers, and people that did not vote, which was not the case in France. So that might be one thing that is skewed. It was launched in October 2019. It was supposed to last for 6 weekends. They managed to get 1 extra weekend after. And 5 million euros were committed to this process. So in the picture, you can see the place where it's hosted. It's called the CESE, so Conseil économique, social et environnemental, so the Economic, Social and Environmental Council. It is considered to be the 3rd chamber of the Republic, but contrary to the Senate or the National Assembly, it doesn't write laws. It just produces recommendation or advice that it transmits to Parliament and government, but they don't. They are not at all forced to take those advice into account. And they are populated. This chamber is populated by representative of the organized society, so unionists, people from association and stuff like that. So the way, I can't go into too much detail, but if you're interested, feel free to contact me afterwards. The way it's organized, so there is 2 co-presidents, one of them being, they're both working in think tank. One of them was the chief negotiator for the COP21 in Paris. One rapporteur, which is from the CESE, some CESE members, expert, activists, unionists, lobbyists. And here, and I'm going to show you at the end, it's a very different assembly from the from the Irish one, even though when it was crafted, some people claimed that it was really inspired by the Irish process, which was actually not really true, because very few people in France spent time studying the Irish process. Then in terms of deliberation, how does it work? So you have something that was once again not the case in Ireland. You have 5 thematic groups of 30 citizens and 2 animators. They don't have really facilitators. They have animators that are managing the group, but not being at the table. So the 5 thematic were housing, moving, so transportation, producing, consuming, and feeding, food and agriculture. So the question can be raised, is it actually a citizen assembly, or do we have 5 citizen juries? And citizen juries is another type of mini public, which compose of smaller groups of citizens that have a restricted topic. In the sense that you have a restrictive collective intelligence, because you don't have 150 brains with all their diversity working on all the topics. You have 30 brains working on a topic, and then 30 brains working on another topic, right? But you don't have 150 brains working on one topic. There was also a striking asymmetry in the orator's speaking time, and therefore in the information, because some speakers were given 50 minutes, some speakers were given 5 minutes. So once again, contrary to Ireland, and I'm going to sum that up after, there was no time balance. And also, therefore, because a lot of the information was happening in the thematic group, a few was happening in plenary session, but most was happening in the small thematic group, there is an asymmetry in the type of information that the citizens have. Also, the debates were not so much organized to be contradictory. In other type of mini publics, for instance, in the debate on abortion in the Irish Citizen Assembly, the debates were meant to be contradictory, 1 for, 1 against. Here, it was not so much the case. There was no table facilitation, which led to also inequality of speaking time among citizens. There is a form of expert-driven in the sense that you have 2 committees, the support and the legal groups, that are actually advising the assembly from almost start to finish, and that have quite some weight in it. And then there is the fact that the outcome is uncertain. So in the commitment of the president, there is 3 possible outcomes. Either it's directly put through government directives, if it's the level of competence of the government. Either it goes to parliamentary debate, sorry, I made a mistake there. Either it is put through referendum. But then we can also wonder if there is not a 3rd or maybe a 5th option, which is nothing at all, like for the Grand Débat National, or some form of cherry picking where some recommendations are going to be taken and the rest are going to be tossed to the garbage bin. So yeah, it's quite striking to see how different actually the Irish Citizen Assembly, which I also worked on for several years, and this assembly are, in the sense that on the point of the topic, you have multiple topics in the Irish Citizen Assembly, which make them have to go faster on each one, less time with it. Well, you have a unique one in France. The mandate originated by government but was ratified by Parliament in Ireland, while in France it was just a letter from the Prime Minister, so there was no parliamentary debate about this deliberative device. In terms of length, you have 11 weekends, or 12 actually maybe, and then I need to correct that, in over a total of 1.5 years in Ireland, and only 2 on climate, when in France you have 7 weekends over 9 months. The budget in France is bigger, and in terms of the organizers, it was very much oriented toward impartiality in Ireland. They wanted apolitical, independent personnel. So there was a Supreme Court judge that was chairing, and senior civil servants that were organizing, and some university professor to do the advice. And in France, you have really politically involved people. You have presidents from think tank, you have activists, you have unionists, you have lobbyists, and professors that are also involved in political life. In terms of sample, you have 99 citizens in Ireland, but for a population of 5 million people, while in France you have 150 citizens for 65 million people. And in terms of subdivision, I told you there is the thematic group in France, while in Ireland there was the single room. So there were 14 tables, 7 citizens roughly each, and a facilitator and a taker at each table. And therefore, all the citizens were hearing the same experts and deliberating at the same time about the same information, which is actually not the case in France. A big difference in terms of facilitation. And I already speak about the fact that the experts don't have the same speaking time in France, contrary to Ireland. And also the fact that in Ireland, there was a lot of focus on professors and discussing established facts. Well, in France, there is also people that are unionists or CEO or have direct interest in something and are trying to put their proposition. A lot more would need to be said, but if you're interested in reading, I'm writing papers, scientific papers when I can, and you can find them all open access. I'm really committed to open access, and if you're interested in learning more, here is my mail, here is my Twitter, and I hope that was kind of enlightening. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Dimitri. Maybe just quickly, because that was a question that was very specific, can you quickly explain the difference between facilitators and animators? Tessel asked for that.
Okay, so the animators, they are, so I'm going to start with facilitators because that's usually what you have in a deliberative mini-public. Facilitators are sitting at your table. They are going to check that the speaking is spread among the citizens around the table. So for instance, if you realize that John is quiet, you're going to say, John, would you like to comment and say something? And the note taker just writes down everything that's said, so nothing goes forgotten. The animator in France, which is something that I didn't saw before in other mini-publics, actually I saw it once, but it was a smaller mini-public anyway, cannot be at all the table at the same time. It's not possible. So it's going to give the general rule. So this morning we're going to focus on writing the intention that you want to carry on. And if you need any help, ask me. And then he's going to sometimes go to the table and say, is everything okay? Do you need some help? And sometimes he gives some advice, and he moves to the other table. And when the time is out, you say, time is out. Okay, so no, let's go, all 30 of us in the groups, let's share the proposition, let's hear it. What the facilitator allows, which I think is maybe an important part, is the fact that you are micromanaging the dynamics and the inequality. You try to even or reduce the inequality of speaking within a small table of 7 people. An animator cannot do that, unfortunately. So that would be the main difference. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for clarifying this. For the other questions, we will get back to this after Camille's part. Camille will now jump into the microcosm really from Wageningen and their interactions with the local municipality. Yeah, just go for it.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me well, everyone. Okay, that's great. Let's share my screen. There we go. That works? Okay. Yeah, so from my side, as a last speaker, some insights from a pilot project, which we're running here in Wageningen, a small town in the Netherlands. And I think the main difference with the other presentations you've just heard is the fact that this is very local, and it concerns a small town. It doesn't concern national decisions. I am in a working group together with one other student. I'm a student at Wageningen University, and two employees from the municipality itself. So I'm going to go, first of all, a little bit into the context of, why did the municipality choose to do this? Because it is actually one of the first in the Netherlands. How I got involved and how the other student got involved. We're actually both active in Extinction Rebellion Wageningen, but more on that later. Then some more on the actual design of our Citizens Assembly, which is very much flexible still. We haven't started it yet, so a lot can change. So it's really, the beginning stage, basically. Then some implementation challenges and lessons, which I already draw from the first experience. So Wageningen, well, it's a small town. For those who don't know it, 40,000 inhabitants, roughly in the middle of the country. It is the city of life sciences, is how it markets itself, mainly because of the Wageningen University, which is a university that is very environmentally focused, and also focused on agriculture, plant technology, and agrotechnology. And it has quite a green and progressive image. So it is really, well, the government is kind of, it consists of left greenish parties. So then they started last year in October a new process started by the party D66 about democratic renewal. So the local government wanted to have new tools to have the people discuss with them. So they wanted more involvement, more inclusion of the citizens. They were noticing that it was usually the same group of citizens that was active in their co-creation sessions. So they decided to host some sessions, which were just open invites, so no selection, no representation, basically. Just open invites to their citizens, come join us to talk about democracy. And that resulted in, well, 4 distinct programs, one of which was the Citizens Assembly. And that was actually where we as Extinction Rebellion Wageningen put some pressure. So, well, we knew that these talks were ongoing. We decided to join some of these evenings and give our ideas. And actually the idea of a Citizens Assembly on the local scale was very well received. People were enthusiastic, so that was one of the core results of these sessions. Other initiatives, to shortly mention them, is the right to challenge, which is basically when citizens think that they can do some part of the municipal, of what the municipality does, they can do it better, and they can challenge the municipality with their proposal. Clare is basically an initiative to have simple language so that everyone in the community and the municipality can understand what the municipality does. And they want to have a digital platform which serves as kind of a community space. So the Citizens Assembly is a pilot project, so it's really a test whether the local government wants to do more with this. It's been approved by the council this year. There has been a budget allocated. It's not very royal, but it is a small budget. And as I said, we have a 4-person working group. And around us are a legal advisor, for example, and a privacy advisor for support. Well, we plan to start late 2020. Of course, the corona crisis has delayed things a little bit. And the topic will be on poverty. Of course, we would have wanted to see a climate change related topic. However, the municipality decided that this pilot coincided very well with another project they were starting about poverty. So they decided to merge them. And a first proposal has now been submitted to the council as kind of a first draft design, and they're going to discuss it soon. So a little bit about how we got involved as Extinction Rebellion. Well, as I said, we were trying to update ourselves on what the municipality was doing. And I think that is one of the most important things. Make sure for maybe some people around you that want to see if their local government can do something like this as well. Make sure you know what they're up to. And maybe they have started already some of these initiatives, and make sure you're present at those table discussions, basically, because they often really value citizen input. And yeah, we were very welcome at the sessions to share our ideas. Also, if the municipality is not so engaged with this topic, there are often moments in which you can write to politicians or parties, especially those that prioritize democratic renewal. Write them and say, hey, this municipality is doing this and they have great experiences. We see it happening on various national scales. And just try to convince them that this is a good idea. Maybe they will start to include it on their political plans. And a small warning there, which is something we struggled with a little bit. Of course, Extinction Rebellion is, an organization with clear demands that, well, some people support, others don't. And it's important to carefully consider under which flag you operate. If you're coming from an organization, do you want to carry that to the working group that you might end up into? Or do you want to put that stamp on your influence? We decided to have that, as less as possible, basically. We decided to not put the Extinction Rebellion logo, on our papers and stuff when we had meetings, just because we thought that might stir up conspiracy. The municipality might not want to work with us. There are various other actions ongoing at the same time with Extinction Rebellion and the municipality. But that is always an important decision to make. And also, we were quite lucky that this was just something that came up, that we got the invite from the municipality. So it's also just a matter of luck a little bit. So yeah. Then the design. Yes, so this is quite a full slide showing what we thought are the main components of the Citizens Assembly. So first of all, of course, you have the participants, the selection of the participants itself, so the sampling, the information phase and deliberation phase, which we haven't worked out very much yet. So in our heads right now, they're quite separated. They might also be merged. Also the mandate, which is very important, which I'll get back later, and transparency, which I think is also very interesting, and I haven't heard us discuss a lot today. Well, first of all, the participants, we aim at having 50 to 60 in the Citizens Assembly with a small buffer so that you can account for people that might not be able to join. And basically, participants can include all residents of Wageningen voting age or above. And just like we've seen in the French example, we would like to do is stratified sampling with a pre-selection in which we send out 5,000 letters, for example. We haven't really fixed that number yet because it's really, it's hard to estimate the response you will get. And right now we have, well, basically 4 criteria. That is the neighborhood people come from, live in, their sex, their age, and eventually also their income. So we write a letter to people and they can sign up basically themselves. And then we have, well, let's say hundreds of signups. And those people, we know their characteristics. Then we also ask them to indicate in which income bracket they fall, which is quite relevant for a poverty assembly, of course. And then based on all that information, we make our final selection, which hopefully will be representative. So yeah, that's kind of the process. For the information phase, of course, it's very important to have equal information for all participants and that this information is not biased towards one side of the debate. And it's also important for us that the municipality can sketch the context of what it's already doing. So we think it's important for them to have a clear platform as well. And this, as I said, this is something we haven't really worked out fully yet. The main challenge will definitely be to balance objectivity. I saw some questions already in the chat appearing about, who decides, who are experts. In our case, in the poverty topic, we might also consider people with experience with living in poverty, ervaringsdeskundige in Dutch, because they can tell a very different kind of story from someone who is maybe just a policymaker or an academic who has never really experienced living in poverty. So yeah, we're still very much looking into designing that further. Then deliberation is a minimum. I have here 2 now, but it should be 4 actually. Oh, sorry. Deliberation is 2 days and the information phase is 2 days. So we have a very short period of time, which is basically, it comes from the fact that we have talked to citizens about this design, and a lot of citizens have come to us with the concern that people might not be able to commit more than 4 days to something like this. And which is also kind of my question to the others here in the room, what your experience is with that, because the other assemblies were quite a lot longer. But that is something we are also struggling with. And of course, in the deliberation phase, a challenge is really to make all voices heard with proper facilitation. Then the mandate, which I think is very important. So what power does the assembly actually have? And here we really saw that the municipality was very interested in how we were designing this or proposing to have this. Of course, they wanted to have a very big say in this. The council has really been present, especially on this point. And now we're more or less settled at a comply or explain principle, which basically says, well, the Citizens Assembly can make a proposal to the council, and then the council has to either accept it or provide a, well, elaborate explanation on why it doesn't. Of course, this kind of is not really what we hope the Citizens Assembly will have in the future, the kind of power that it has. We hope that for future versions of this Citizens Assembly, this can slowly expand. So that is really our strategy from Extinction Rebellion, that we hope that the trust in this kind of assembly will increase, and that slowly the mandate will increase as well, so the power it has. But we also realize that we can't move too fast, because otherwise the municipality might give on the concept as a whole. And lastly, transparency, which we think is very important, to let people know what happens inside the rooms of the Citizens Assembly. Of course, this is very privacy sensitive. You can't just videotape everyone in a room and then just broadcast that information. So we're still looking into how to do that exactly, but one thing that we want to do definitely is to live stream, for example, or at least record the expert talks and the Q&As, so that people know what kind of information was given, and they can judge from the outside whether they think that was balanced. So this is roughly the time planning, the strategy we have in mind. First, of course, the development, then the actual
Sorry,
pilot.
Camille, just
Yes.
quickly, do you think you can round off in like a minute or so that we still have time for questions? Cool.
Yeah, definitely. So the pilot will run, well, hopefully at the end of this year. Then we'll evaluate, and of course, at some point we would like to have a climate assembly. We think the municipality is really fit for that because of a green image. So we hope we can achieve that later. Some challenges, I mentioned a lot of them before as well, but the key ones are really experience, knowledge, and budget. We don't have a lot of experts in our working group, so that's why I'm very happy to be here today. Also, the sampling is quite difficult because you don't know what data is available, whether you can actually ask people for all that data. The government can also not simply provide all the data for you, although they might have it. So those are very practical things. Encouraging participation. Some citizens that have worked with us have asked, can we be compensated for this kind of work we do? Of course, that's something to consider. Doesn't fit into our budget at the point, but can be relevant as well. We know that other assemblies have looked into it. Negotiating a mandate, as I've said, is quite difficult, and shaping the deliberation. So the main lessons from my side personally is that there are very many different design choices you can make for an assembly. It starts with the size, the selection criteria, but also deliberation, of course, is subject to a lot of different options. And a lot of them just haven't been explored yet. So we really want to encourage a lot of pilots or experiments to be started around this, so that we can gather experience as a whole, as a community, and slowly to work towards a model that really works on a local level. And I think it's relatively unexplored territory, so a lot is new for a lot of people, which clearly shows also from the academic literature that's available. And it's important to co-design with citizens also, if that's not a fully representative body, so throughout the process, involve other citizens, discuss the plans you're making. And yeah, more lessons are to be learned. We're not yet halfway this concept, so I'm very excited what the future might bring for this. And that's it. So I hand it over to Leonard again.
Cool. Thanks so much, Camille. I think really interesting to hear also the local perspective. And there are so many citizens' assemblies that are going on in municipalities that are often not being talked about, and I think it's really interesting. So we have a lot of, quite some questions, and there are some that are more, let's say, factual, let's say, was it representative or not? So I would say that we maybe park them and respond to them in writing, because I think it's now more interesting to go more a bit into the juicy ones. Let's see, there was 2 questions about how we can connect more, for example, digital issues. So it jumps right into the Corona issue, how can we have deliberations when we can't meet? But there was also a question if citizens' assemblies can be run live broadcasted or so. So maybe, Dimitri, you have studied some citizens' assemblies, but also question to everyone, any thoughts on if this could work using digital technology, or if you have experience with using digital technology in the deliberations? I would say just any one of you picks the question.
So they did it for the last few meetings of the French Assembly, and I'm aware that they did the same in the UK. So the last meeting was actually being done remotely. I think the British were smarter than the French in the way they organized it, in the sense that the French Assembly was long. It was 2 days straight from morning to evening with breaks, but it was very long. I mean, it was 7 hours on the first day, and then even more on the second day, and it was Friday and Saturday. And I was not deliberating, I was writing what I was seeing, but I was exhausted at the end. And I think the British were a bit smarter in the sense that they did shorter slots spread out of more days, and I think that was the good way to go. So it's possible. I mean, it was actually on Zoom, same as us, and then they had the little rooms for the thematic groups, and then they actually little groups then going back and so on. It was just more exhausting, and it was leading to more top-down organizations, so citizens has less opportunity to voice their concern when they were disagreeing, and overall, less people talk online. There was the inequality of talking. There were some citizens that talked a lot, but in the end of the week, at the end of the 2 days, very few citizens that actually spoke. So that's work in progress for what's to come, I think. But I would tend to think that it's actually important to do them in presential. I don't know if you say that, but non-remote, because it's not just a political experience, it's also a social experience for the people that take part in it. And the fact that there is important stuff that happen at lunch break, and when they take the coffee and stuff like that. It's not just at the table. So I would be very careful. I know that there is right now a local online assembly that is launched in the UK as well. I saw that yesterday in the newspaper. But I would be cautious, because I think you would lose a lot part of the social and friendly component that is built from having people in the same room.
Okay, cool. Claire, maybe did you use any technology also like this during the Irish Citizens Assembly?
Yeah, all of our assemblies were streamed from the start. They didn't stream now the deliberations, and they tried to keep the members anonymous, because we were debating on abortion rights, and obviously there was really strong lobby groups on both sides, so they really tried to keep our faces private.
Claire, I think there is a misunderstanding. There is two topics. One of them is deliberating without being in the same room, and the other is live streaming to the public.
Yeah. no, we didn't have to. We didn't really have to do that. No, so that wasn't a thing for us.
Okay, cool. I also saw that you already responded to the question, Claire, about the experts, how they were being chosen. I would say let's not go super into the depths of it, but maybe you can say a bit about like the experts. If you felt that they were balanced, did you feel like there was already influence that was also exerted by the way experts were chosen? And then the details, maybe people can also read up in the link that you shared.
Yeah, for each topic there was an expert advisory committee, and that was selected by the Citizens Assembly staff, I suppose, and they were all, I was just looking at the list there, like all of them were academics. For climate change specifically, it was all academics. There were no real representatives of the private sector or even activist groups, and then those academics in the expert advisory group then chose the experts to speak. So it wasn't actually the advisory group that spoke, but they then picked the speakers, which is I suppose it is interesting, because then we did have a lot of academics speaking to us. But like Dimitri said, there was so much focus on like balanced and unbiased information that I suppose that's the angle they were coming from there.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Claire. Darragh, you got a question that I thought was really interesting. I can't see, unfortunately, anymore who it was, but the basic question is, why is it important that characteristics of citizens are represented proportionately, so gender, age, whatever, as like all the others? Isn't not actually more important that just political views are represented, which is the case in electorate representative democracy? So I think it's an interesting question. Maybe you can give your take on that.
Yes, thank you. That is a really interesting question. And I mean, I definitely see the point that, you know, political views are important, but I think it is important that decision making is representative in terms of who's making the decisions, because everybody lives a different reality, right? So depending on whether you're a man or a woman or another gender, or depending on your socioeconomic status, your race, you live a different reality. You've got a completely different view on the world based on that. I think it's important that decision making reflects all those different views. I mean, just taking a clear example, let's say based on the Dutch case, the Netherlands is a very ethnically diverse country, but most of the decision makers are white. Now, people from non-white backgrounds face a lot of disadvantages in life, which white people maybe know if they study about it, but they don't really understand that because they haven't lived it. And so to take decisions on it, it's quite difficult if you've never lived that reality. So I think it is important that you have those different, not just political views, but different experiences of reality reflected in the decision-making process.
I mean, the question was specifically for you, Darragh, but if you three want to give your take on this as well, like maybe one or two of you, I think it's a very interesting question that we could discuss very long.
From an Irish perspective, I know someone there said it in the chat that there were no people of colour on the Irish Assembly at all throughout the entire process, and that would be a total of 150 different people altogether, which was a real shame, I think. And I would definitely question whether or not it really was representative of Irish society, because there were no minorities there at all, and it also, I suppose, only represents people who are able to commit to that many weekends over the course of a year, which would leave out a lot of people, including maybe parents or people with certain occupations that they would have to work at the weekend, because there was no financial remuneration for being on the Assembly. So
yeah, that's if I can comment on that. Yeah, in that regard, the Irish one was a bit weird compared to the other, which was actually due to its restricted budget, which was usually in Citizen Assembly you're paid to come. So what they did for the Irish was that they paid you back for the money you spend on coming there if you took the train or the car or whatever, and they host you for free in the hotel, and they pay for your meals, but there was no payment for the day, when in France it's around 80 euros per days, and in Canada, both in Ontario and British Columbia, it was also paid. which indeed makes a difference from some people. I think, I mean, I wrote, if you're interested, I wrote a paper exactly about like why the Irish case looks different from other cases. It's a paper that I wrote in 2018. And so I compare the fact that in the Canadian Assembly there is almost no turnover. Like the people that committed day one, they stayed until the last day. Well, in the Irish Assembly there was a lot of turnover. I think one other reason is that the fact that there was multiple topics. So people gave their topic and their attention to all the speaker on abortion, and they voted on abortion, and then they were like, okay, well, I did my part for abortion, I'm going away. Because aging, none of the knowledge I had on abortion is going to help me deal with aging or climate. So I think that's also a very important factor, and I dwell on it at length if you like to read scientific literature. But I think if we can go back to on the question of representation, there is really like 3 dimensions I would say that are crucial. It's demographic factors, and then of course, depending on the country you are, there is different relevant factors. For instance, in France, race or ethnicity, you cannot. While in Australia, when they had a random panel, and in Canada, indigenous, native representative were important, so they were integrated. So that's the first step, demographic. Then there is attitudes, opinion. And neither in Ireland, neither in France, there was a check to check that there was actually an opinion representation of the population in the assembly, which I think is not the best. It should be done, and I think deliberative polls or the Citizen Assembly on Brexit show us it can be done, and I think it's important to think that the assembly is not skewed from the start in terms of opinion, that the opinion are representative, and then you can see how it evolves. So it's quite interesting for quantitative analysis. And then the third part, which I think is maybe really important and overlooked, like, oh, it's not interesting, is the expert representation or the speaker representation. There are people coming to the assembly and they're going to give a point of view. And there you can really have completely unbalanced panels of experts that are more or less on the same line and are going to feed the same fact. And I think that's where climate is a difficult question, because for abortion it's clear, either you're for, either you're against abortion. It's quite straightforward. So that's what we call a closed question, yes, no. Climate is not a closed question, it's an open question. Are you for lithium, nuclear power, reducing consumption, agroforestry, stopping meat consumption? There is so many questions that can go on. So there, it's not very evident to look at a panel of experts and say it's so skewed. But what I wrote down is that both in France and Ireland, for instance, the question of cutting ties with the very concept of growth was not a subject for debate brought by experts. There was no debate with one economist that say growth is an important concept and one other that say no, and actually we have other indicators than GDP. And that can be a legitimate debate to have. So the expert selection is actually something really key to consider.
I think this also leads us to 2 other questions that were very much related to this, I would say. Like one thing was how minority voices are heard. So like the question was concretely, what happens to the minority after the vote? But also the other one was, how can you make sure that out-of-the-box thoughts that sometimes are correlated with minority groups are not pressed down, so that they also get a space in the Citizens' Assembly to speak up. So maybe let's start with the second one, like out-of-the-box ideas. Like, is there a way through facilitation to, let's say, elicit or allow for these out-of-the-box ideas?
I totally agree with that, that I don't think there was any space for generation of new ideas or being innovative. And yeah, now that you say that, like that was one of my issues at the very end of the assembly. I felt that we had experts feeding their life's work to us sometimes, and they obviously had their own opinions and interest in what direction it would go. But at the same time, we were so overwhelmed by the amount of material that we were consuming that we were almost asking the experts to tell us what to recommend to the government, because there wasn't that space for thinking outside the box at all.
I think also, like, once again, it really depends to what you feed in the assembly. So if you look, for instance, at the 13 recommendation on climate from the Irish, some of them, actually, the chair during the last session, she said, oh, that recommendation is directly coming from the fact that we heard about this expert that say that we should include it. So it didn't came directly from citizens sometimes, and it was quite clear. And then I think it's also interesting to see how the people supposed to help and facilitate, not so much the facilitator, but like the expert, the referee expert that are there to say what exists and not, tend to be quite conservative, especially when they're for legal background. What exists is what's good in their frame of mind. And it was really interesting because actually I was doing observation yesterday with another webinar of the convention, and there is several times where the expert said it's impossible to. And they didn't speak about laws of thermodynamics. That's impossible to change. Gravity is impossible to change on Earth. But law, nothing is impossible. I mean, I'm a political scientist, and one of my reference in philosophy is Cornelius Castoriadis, which was a great French philosopher. And his concept is that there is two types of society: autonomous society, and autonomous, which we, the humans, are making the rules and the norms and the social norms that we live in, and heteronomous society, that think that the norms and the laws, they come from outside, from God, from the tradition, from the ones who know, from whatever. It's interesting to see that there is a bit of a what's our habit is impossible to change. No, I mean, at some point one of the experts says we cannot not have 5G. 5G is going to happen. We cannot decide that we don't want to have 5G, for instance. Another one said we cannot do that because globalization. But I mean, those stuff, the laws, globalization or technological, we made them. So we should decide what we make with them. And for instance, there was a very interesting proposal that was made on reducing working hours in order to lower our impact on the planet. And there was some answer like the economists are going to disagree with that proposition, and it's like, no, there is no such thing as the economists. The economists are a group of people that disagree with them and have arguments all the time. Political scientists as well. We don't have a consensus on a lot of things. So it's complicated because on the one hand, you need to have a scientific input into citizen panels, otherwise just have referendum directly. There is no added value, but then it needs to be put in the assembly in such a way that there is always a contradiction. Every time you invite an expert that holds point A, unless this point A is contested by no scientist ever, you have to invite another expert that's going to hold the contrary point of view. And that's how, that's actually the very definition of deliberation. Hearing the pro et contra and then evaluating, weighting the arguments. If you don't have that, you don't have deliberation, you have something else.
I think maybe for another webinar, Darragh, I think the whole discussion about the first demand, sciences, role of scientists in society with this whole discussion, I would find this topic really interesting to also go more into depth with that. There was maybe two more questions. Armando, we are already above, like, out of time. So maybe for people who have to go and you want to go now, maybe just thanks for joining. And Armando, we will share stuff afterwards, right?
Yeah, definitely. I've got the emails of all of you, I believe. Okay. So I'll send you some information, including this video, several presentations if speakers agree, and perhaps some other stuff. So definitely you're going to receive those by tomorrow, the latest.
Okay. I mean, I would say if people have time, we can still discuss two questions. I just want to say if people need to go, that we have a proper closing. But there was a question. Let's see, where do I have it now? Well, then just go for this one first. Eva asked specifically to you, Dimitri, about the size of the question. She asked, would it be better to have a citizens' assembly deliberate about climate change as a broad issue or more sub-questions that are more specific?
That's a really tricky question. So on the one hand, the more you narrow down the topic, the easier it is to skew it. I'm going to ask you to discuss about agriculture, but I'm not going to ask you to discuss about globalization. I'm not going to ask you to discuss about type of food consumption. So the more you narrow it down, the easier it is to restrain the field of what is perceived as possible, right? If the topic is climate change, we can start by saying, okay, do we want to keep globalization as it is? Do we want to keep selling as many cars to the US as the US are selling us? Is that making sense to us or not at all? Which is not possible if your topic is limited. On the other hand, if you're given everything, you're going to perhaps get lost. So I'm not designing assemblies. I'm studying them, but I'm not organizing them. But the thing is that maybe that's off the top of my head right now. What would make sense is to start with broad questions about like global frame, and then go slowly into more details, and possibly have different panels to do that. So one first to work on like global frames. Do we want to keep these global trends or not? Do we think GDP is a relevant indicator? And then for the other panel, we don't take GDP into account. We don't care that it's going to make GDP go lower because we decided before that GDP is not relevant. So then we can go into, okay, how we think agriculture and transport and stuff like that. So what happened with the French one is actually it was broadened. They didn't have any constraint. Then the organizer decided to divide the 5 topics. So it already created a division. If you were randomly assigned to your thematic group. So if you were interested in talking about production and you were put into housing, well, you were put into housing. Tough luck. And then the stuff as well is that because Macron said that it would be without filter as long as the proposals are really well written, it made them go into very, very specific details. Like very quickly they went into like, contrary to this European law, can we blah, blah, blah with this norm? And maybe it would have been better to start with a broad debate of like, what type of society do we want? What type of world do we want to live in? What are our values as human beings in this society? And then, okay, know what are the tools, laws, reforms, quotas, obligations that are going to allow us to reach that goal, which is the society we want to live in. And it didn't quite work like that. They went into technicality quickly. So, but I'm not a genius designer, so that's what I can think of given the observation I made.
Maybe, I mean, of course, you too, Camille and Darragh, you can also say something about this. I guess you also have more the theoretical background on this largest question. So maybe also to Clare, I mean, you already indicated a bit that the question wasn't so good on the climate change issue in Ireland, right? Like, what's your take on the mandate there?
Yeah, ours was incredibly broad. It was how the state can make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change. So along with looking with all the different aspects of climate change, we also had to think of how can Ireland be a leader in doing this, which I just think was so bizarre because we were so far behind. To ask us to suddenly become leaders was just a bit mad. And yeah, no, I thought it was very broad. I think specific, like for abortion, for example, it was a specific question. It was, should we have a referendum on the 8th Amendment? Whereas climate change, it was just so broad and really, really difficult question to answer, especially when it comes into like what even is a leader when it comes to tackling climate change, and who should we look to replicate that. So yeah, I would definitely agree that it should be more specific. I like the idea of thinking of like what are our values and what should a society look like, or what would we like it to look like, because that never really came into it.
Just one thing to add on that. I definitely see both points of view, and I can see, you know, being too broad, it can be hard to get to any real recommendations. On the other hand, I think someone already mentioned if you do make it too specific, then you can really kind of control the debate, and that's not necessarily good either. And maybe an example here is, I think if I remember from Dimitri's presentation, the French Citizen Assembly said, well, okay, what can the state do to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. But that leaves out the debate of, well, is that a sufficiently ambitious target? And actually the science says that that's not. It's definitely not ambitious enough for a developed country like France to be hitting 40% by 2030. So you're missing a really important question there by already making the question too specific. So yeah, maybe I don't have the right answer either. I could definitely see both points, but making it too specific has a danger.
I mean, maybe to also just give one thing in there, like the case that I know from this East Belgium region where they speak, like the German-speaking region of Belgium, where they implemented citizens' assemblies in their constitution is also really interesting, where they have one citizens' assembly that defines the question, and then for every question that is being established, another citizens' assembly is set up to find the answer to that question. So it's also to someone else ask a question like, you know, how can isn't it like capture of the state of the citizens' assembly if they define a very narrow question? This way you can give people power to the definition of the topic and people power to the defining of the answer. So I think that's also an interesting example to look at.
Yeah, an alternative to that is what they did in the US for 10 years now, and we just imported it in Switzerland. It's called the Citizen Initiative Review. So we don't call it a citizen assembly per se. It looks a lot like a citizen assembly, but it's smaller. It's around 30 people. And it deliberates for a shorter amount of time, 2 weekends. And here is that in the states, so in the US, where they have the right to initiative, so where citizens can gather a signature, and then if they have enough signature, that become passed to a vote. We don't call that a referendum because usually the referendum comes from top and this is from bottom, so this is initiative votation. And we have that in Switzerland, and for 10 years now they're doing that in the US, in Oregon, they did that in Massachusetts, California, Washington, I think. And so the point is that so the topic is decided by the people that are putting this petition, right? So they are deciding the question, and the question could be a much more ambitious question that the government is putting. And it's really like the people deciding. It's not a tiny group of randomly selected citizens. It's a very large number of people signing and then voting. Everybody can vote on that. And then the problem that my American colleagues saw, and that we have the same one in Switzerland, is that we don't have threshold for how much money rich people or political group can spend in campaign. So they can skew massively the information that is gathered and fed to people before a vote. So they can skew a vote. And they can give fake news, and they can put smear campaign and lies. And so what usually the voters received is the argument made by the pro, the argument made by the people against that are sent to them. And before, they had the stuff also wrote by the government. So the government is telling you that this initiative is about that. But then it turns out that the recommendation that were supposed to be impartial given by the government were not impartial. When the government liked the initiative, it was saying a lot of nice stuff about it. And when the government didn't like the initiative, it was saying it was terrible. So therefore, the idea was like, what if we ask that this information is written by a group of randomly selected diverse citizens? And then they are going to audition experts from both sides that are going to tell them whatever, and then they select, and we conducted a panel at a local level last winter in Switzerland. So I was actually involved in that. So then they have to select what are the arguments in general, that the information in general that people should be aware of before they vote. So our stuff was on housing. So it was, for instance, the number of people owning their own house in Switzerland, which is very few, for instance, and blah, blah, blah. And then if I want to vote against, what are the most relevant arguments? So then 3 arguments that are the most relevant to vote against, and then 3 arguments that are the most relevant to vote for. So they don't say what you should vote. They say, this is are the information that are important to make a smart vote about the question. So that's another way of giving the question to another entity, so it's not skewed.
We are now 50 minutes over, so I think we should round off. Just quickly, Eva, you are in the Future of Democracy Working Group in Extinction Rebellion Netherlands, right? So I thought it might be nice if there are any upcoming events or anything that people can still follow up on in the Netherlands who are interested in the topic of deliberative democracy, citizens' assemblies. Is there anything that people can follow up with, events or materials or platforms? And let's try to keep it short because we're already quite over.
Not sure.
Yeah.
Perfect. Nice. You unmuted me. Yeah.
Oh no.
Thank you. First of all, thanks was super overflow. And then from a Dutch perspective,
Okay,
for the internal, like from a future of democracy perspective, we're actually organizing internally. Is my connect? Am I still there?
Yeah, let's maybe do it by text then. Like if the connection is not so good, we just gonna send it then with the mail. Like, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. No worries. That's totally fine. Yeah.
But yeah, thanks also for all the speakers, Darragh, for organizing this. I learned a lot, super interesting. And also for all the people who are here, would be cool if you stay in touch. Also, of course, not just the people in the Netherlands. It's a global issue, of course. Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining. Darragh, maybe one or two last things that I forgot.
No, well, just to say thank you to Leonard for facilitating. I think he did a great job, and thanks to all the speakers. I have to say I learned a lot as well, and I appreciate you all giving your time on a Thursday evening, and I appreciate everyone who joins for giving their time. So thanks a lot, and we will have more events like this. So do stay tuned, keep an eye on the Extinction Rebellion website and Facebook page, and have a good evening.
Bye-bye.